The morning sun had barely risen when Marie checked her phone one last time, making sure she had the right address. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood in front of the massive iron gates of the Thompson estate. This wasn't just another cleaning job. This was her chance at something better, a step up from juggling 3 different houses just to make ends meet. "Good morning. I'm here for the housekeeping position." She spoke into the intercom, her voice steady despite her nerves. The gates opened with a quiet hum, revealing a winding driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. As she walked up the path, Marie couldn't help but think about how different her life could have been. 15 years ago, she'd had everything. A small but cozy apartment, a beautiful baby boy, and dreams of going back to school. Then came the layoffs at the factory, the mounting bills, and that horrible day when her son was taken away. The system that was supposed to help had failed them both, leaving her with nothing but a handful of photos and a lifetime of regret. The front door opened before she could ring the bell, and there stood Mrs. Thompson, dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than Marie made in 3 months. But there was kindness in her eyes, something Marie hadn't expected from someone who lived in a house with marble fountains and a 4-car garage. "You must be Marie. Please come in." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. "Rebecca from the agency told me wonderful things about your work." The inside of the house was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers, artwork on every wall, and floors so shiny Marie could see her reflection. But what caught her eye wasn't the luxury, it was the warmth. Family photos lined the hallway, hand-drawn pictures were proudly displayed on the fridge, and a half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table. During the tour, Mrs. Thompson explained the daily routine. "We're pretty relaxed here," she said, showing Marie the kitchen. "My husband's usually at the office, and our son's away at college most of the year. He's coming home next week for summer break, actually." Marie nodded, taking mental notes about which products to use on the antique wooden tables and how Mrs. Thompson liked the laundry folded. But her mind kept drifting to her own son. He'd be in college now, too, if life had been kinder. She'd never stopped looking for him, never given up hope that somehow, someday, they'd find each other again. "And this is where we keep all the cleaning supplies," Mrs. Thompson was saying, opening a closet door. "Oh, and one more thing." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "These are yours. We trust our staff here, Marie. You're part of the household now." Standing there, holding those keys, Marie felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. This wasn't just about dusting expensive furniture or washing designer clothes. This was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life in a place where she was treated with respect. Little did she know, this job would change her life in ways she could never imagine. As she started her first tasks of the day, Marie had no idea that fate had finally decided to be kind, leading her right where she needed to be all along. 3 weeks into her new job, Marie had developed a routine. She'd arrive early, before the morning sun hit the mansion's windows, just so she could spend a few extra minutes looking at the family photos. Each day, she discovered something new that made her heart race. That morning, while organizing Mrs. Thompson's study, she found an old photo album tucked away in a drawer. She knew she shouldn't open it, but her hands moved on their own. The first page showed David's adoption day. He was wearing a blue sweater, the exact same sweater she'd bought her son from a thrift store, saving up 3 weeks of grocery money to get it. "You look so much like him," she whispered, touching the photo gently. Her son had loved that sweater, wore it until the elbows had holes. A sound in the hallway made her quickly return the album, but not before she noticed something that stopped her breath. In the background of one photo, there was a worn teddy bear with one eye missing. Her son had the same bear, a gift from his grandmother before she passed. He'd named it Cookie because of its brown color. Later that day, Mrs. Thompson was showing her where to store the fresh linens when David called. The phone was on speaker, and Marie's hands froze mid-fold as she heard his voice. "Mom, guess what?" I aced that big law exam. His excited voice filled the room. That's wonderful, honey. We're so proud of you, Mrs. Thompson beamed. Thanks. Oh, and I found this old box in my dorm room. There's this funny old teddy bear inside, the one-eyed one from when I was little. Remember him? Marie dropped the sheet she was holding. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to pretend to sneeze to hide it. Of course. Cookie, right? You wouldn't go anywhere without him when you first came to us. Mrs. Thompson laughed. The room started spinning. Marie excused herself to get some water, practically running to the kitchen. Cookie. He kept the name. After all these years, he kept the name. During her lunch break, she sat in her car and pulled out her own old photos, the few precious ones she'd managed to keep. Her fingers traced the outline of her little boy's face, playing spot the difference with her memories of David's childhood photos. The same nose, the same way of tilting his head when he smiled, the same birthmark. Back inside, she found herself looking at everything with new eyes. The height marks on the kitchen doorframe, the collection of basketball trophies, the way he wrote his D's in those old school papers she'd seen while cleaning, exactly like his father used to. At the end of her shift, Mrs. Thompson mentioned that David would be coming home for a visit next weekend. You'll finally get to meet him. He's such a sweetheart, always thanking our staff personally. Marie nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm looking forward to it. That night, she couldn't sleep. She pulled out an old shoebox from under her bed, filled with documents from 15 years ago. Adoption papers she'd supposedly signed, but knew she hadn't. Letters to social services that were never answered. Missing person reports that went nowhere. She had to know for sure. But how could she prove it? How could she risk everything? Her job, her sanity, maybe even her last chance to be near him, on what might just be a desperate mother's wishful thinking. Still, something deep in her heart told her she was right. This time was different. This time, she'd finally found him. The day David was supposed to come home, Marie called in sick. She spent hours pacing her small apartment, picking up photos only to put them down again, practicing words that kept getting stuck in her throat. The next day, she knew she had to face him. When she arrived at the mansion, there was an unfamiliar car in the driveway. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw him getting bags from the trunk. Tall, handsome in his college sweatshirt, looking so much like his father it hurt. David glanced up and smiled politely, just another household staff member to him. Hi. You must be the new housekeeper Mom mentioned, he said, and Marie had to grip her cleaning cart to stay standing. His voice, deeper now, but with that same gentle tone she remembered from 15 years ago. Yes, I'm Marie, she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Throughout the morning, she could hear him in different parts of the house, laughing with his mom, talking on the phone with friends, playing the piano in the living room. The same song he used to pick out with one finger when he was little. He taught himself, just like his grandmother had. By afternoon, Marie knew she couldn't hold it in anymore. She found Mrs. Thompson in the kitchen, making David's favorite sandwich, peanut butter with banana slices, no crust. Some things never changed. Mrs. Thompson, Marie's voice shook. I need to tell you something important. Mrs. Thompson must have seen something in Marie's face because she put down the knife she was holding. Of course. Is everything okay? Could we sit down? They moved to the breakfast nook, and Marie pulled out the worn envelope she'd been carrying in her pocket for weeks. Her hands trembled as she spread out the old photos on the table. This is my son, she said, pointing to a school picture. He was taken from me 15 years ago. They said it was temporary, just until I found a new job. But then they stopped answering my calls. Changed their office location. Lost my paperwork. Mrs. Thompson's face softened with sympathy, but then she looked closer at the photos. Marie saw the exact moment realization hit, the color draining from her face, her hand covering her mouth. I never gave him up, Marie continued, her voice growing stronger. I fought for him. I looked everywhere. And now, she pulled out one last photo. Her son at 7 years old, wearing that blue thrift store sweater, holding Cookie, the one-eyed bear. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. Oh my God, she whispered. I know you didn't know, Marie said quickly. I know you love him. I've seen that every day I've worked here. But please, please understand. He's my son. The birthmark on his wrist, his dimple, the way he plays piano, even how he writes his D's, just like his father did. The sound of a backpack dropping made them both turn. David stood in the doorway, his face pale. He'd heard everything. David, honey. Mrs. Thompson started, but he was staring at the photos on the table. He walked closer, slowly, like in a dream. His hand went to his wrist, touching the half-moon birthmark Marie had mentioned. He picked up the photo of himself at 7 in the blue sweater. I remember this sweater, he said quietly. And Cookie. I remember someone singing to me when I was sick. A song about rainbows. Marie couldn't hold back her tears. Your fever was so high. I sang that song for 3 nights straight until it broke. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Mrs. Thompson reached for her phone with shaking hands. I'm calling your father, she said to David. And then I think we need to call our lawyer. David hadn't taken his eyes off the photos. All this time, he whispered, I thought, they told me you didn't want me. Never, Marie said firmly. I never stopped wanting you. Never stopped looking for you. He looked up then, really looked at her, and Marie saw her little boy in his eyes. I remember you, he said softly. I remember your voice. The next few days felt like walking through a dream. After Mr. Thompson rushed home from work that day, the family's lawyer arrived within hours. Marie sat in their elegant living room, clutching her old documents while everyone tried to process what was happening. A DNA test is the only way to be absolutely certain, the lawyer said, looking between Marie and David. The young man hadn't said much since the kitchen revelation, but he kept glancing at Marie when he thought no one was watching. How long will it take? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rush results can come in 5 business days, the lawyer replied, already making calls to set everything up. The waiting period was the hardest part. Marie still came to work. She couldn't afford not to, but everything felt different. Mrs. Thompson looked lost in her own home, often stopping in the middle of conversations to stare into space. Mr. Thompson spent long hours in his study, making phone calls about the adoption agency that had closed years ago. On her 3rd day of waiting, Marie was dusting the family room when David appeared in the doorway. Can we talk? He asked, fidgeting with his college class ring. When Marie nodded, he sat down on the couch, leaving space between them. I found my old baby box yesterday, in the attic. Marie's heart squeezed. Your baby box? Yeah, Mom. I mean, Mrs. Thompson. She kept everything from when I first came here. He pulled something from behind his back, a worn, one-eyed teddy bear. Cookie's been through some tough times. Marie reached out with trembling fingers, but stopped short of touching the bear. You used to tell him all your secrets, she whispered. You said he was the best keeper of secrets because he could only wink, not talk. David's eyes widened. I remember that. I remember sitting in a small room with yellow curtains. Our old apartment, Marie said softly. You helped me make those curtains from an old dress. You said they looked like sunshine. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 15 years hanging between them. Then David pulled out his phone, showing her his background picture. Him with the Thompsons at his high school graduation. They're good people, he said quietly. They gave me everything they could. College, opportunities, love. I know, Marie replied, her heart aching. I've seen how much they love you, how much you love them. But I always wondered. His voice cracked slightly. Every birthday, every achievement, there was this empty space, like a missing puzzle piece. They told me my birth mother chose to give me up, that she wanted a better life for me. But that didn't feel right somehow. Marie fought back tears. I looked for you everywhere. Hired private investigators when I could afford it. Wrote letters to every agency in the state. Some nights, I'd walk through different neighborhoods, just hoping I'd see you playing in someone's yard. David's hands were shaking as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, crumpled, drawn in crayon. A child's drawing of two people holding hands under a rainbow. I kept this, he said. I didn't know why. I just knew it was important. He smoothed out the paper carefully. That's you, isn't it? In the picture? With the curly hair and the blue dress? Marie couldn't speak. She remembered that day perfectly. They'd drawn it together after a rainstorm, sitting on their tiny balcony. She'd been wearing her favorite blue dress, the one she had to sell a month later to pay the electric bill. Just then, Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red, but she managed a small smile. The lab called, she said. They can take the samples tomorrow morning. The next day, Marie and David sat in sterile chairs at the testing facility, neither speaking much as the technician swabbed their cheeks. As they left, David suddenly reached for Marie's hand, squeezing it quickly before letting go. Whatever the results say, he said, looking straight ahead, I'm glad I know the truth about that day, about you never wanting to give me up. 5 days. 5 days to wait. 5 days to hope, to remember, to wonder what would happen next. 5 days that felt like both a moment and an eternity. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Marie was polishing the silverware when Mrs. Thompson found her in the dining room, holding her phone with trembling hands. The results are ready, she said softly. David's already on his way home from campus. The lawyer will be here in an hour. Everything after that seemed to move in slow motion. Marie's fingers kept fumbling with her phone as she called her sister for support. She'd barely slept the past 5 days, spending nights looking through old photo albums and remembering every detail of her little boy's 7 years with her. When the lawyer arrived, they all gathered in the living room. The same room where Marie had dusted photos of David for weeks before realizing who he was. Mr. Thompson sat next to his wife on the sofa, holding her hand. David perched on the armchair, his knee bouncing nervously. Marie's sister held her hand tight as they sat across from them. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the envelope. The results show a 99.9% probability of a mother-child relationship between Marie Wilson and David Thompson. The room went completely silent. Marie felt her sister's hand tighten around hers. Then David let out a shaky breath, and everything seemed to start moving again. There's more, the lawyer continued, pulling out another set of documents. Based on the information you provided, we've uncovered some disturbing details about the adoption agency, New Beginnings Family Services. They were shut down in 2012 for multiple violations, but the records were sealed. Mr. Thompson leaned forward. What kind of violations? They were targeting vulnerable families, particularly single mothers going through financial hardships. They would manipulate temporary custody arrangements into permanent adoptions, often forging signatures and backdating documents. Marie's hands began to shake as memories flooded back. The social worker, she said it was just temporary custody while I found a new job. She brought papers to sign when I was working night shifts, exhausted. I thought I was signing temporary guardianship forms. Mrs. Thompson started crying softly. We had no idea. They showed us papers saying she'd voluntarily given up her rights. We paid them so much money, thought we were doing everything legally. You didn't know, Mary said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. You gave him a beautiful life. You loved him. That's all any mother could want for her child. David stood up suddenly, walking to the window. Everyone watched as he pressed his forehead against the glass, his shoulders tense. "I remember that day," he said quietly, "when they came to get me from school instead of you. They said you were sick, that I had to go with them just for a little while." Marie couldn't hold back her tears anymore. "I went to pick you up, but they said you'd already left. I called the police, but the agency showed them paperwork saying I had signed you away. Nobody would listen." David turned around, his eyes red. "I kept asking for you. They kept saying you'd chosen to let me go, that I needed to forget and be grateful for my new family." He looked at the Thompsons. "And I am grateful. You've been amazing parents. But she's your mother too," Mrs. Thompson finished softly, wiping her eyes. "And she never stopped fighting for you." The lawyer cleared his throat again. "There's going to be a larger investigation. Other families were affected. The people responsible might finally face charges." "What happens now?" David asked, looking between the Thompsons and Marie. Mr. Thompson stood up, straightening his shoulders. "Now we figure out how to be a family. All of us." He turned to Marie. "You didn't just find your son today. He found his mother. And maybe we all found something more." Marie watched as David walked over and sat between her and Mrs. Thompson. He took both their hands, and in that moment, she realized that love didn't have to be divided. It could be multiplied. Her son had two mothers who loved him, two different kinds of families that could become something new together. "I want to know everything," David said quietly. "About before. About you. About us." "We have time now," Marie whispered. "We have all the time in the world." The investigation into New Beginnings Family Services moved faster than anyone expected. One morning, about 3 weeks after the DNA results, Marie arrived at the Thompson house to find a detective waiting in the kitchen. "We found others," the detective said, spreading files across the kitchen table. 12 families so far, all with similar stories. Single parents, usually mothers, all going through hard times. All told it was temporary. All had their signatures forged. David sat next to Marie, their shoulders touching. He'd started doing that lately, finding small ways to be close to her while they figured out their new normal. Mrs. Thompson stood behind them, one hand resting supportively on David's back. The main social worker, she kept records, the detective continued. Hidden files about which families were most vulnerable. How much they could get for each child. He paused, looking at David. "Your adoption brought them $50,000. $50,000. Marie's voice cracked. "I lost my son over $50,000. She remembered counting pennies for gas, skipping meals so he could eat, working double shifts until she could barely stand. I would have found a way to pay that much. I would have done anything." David squeezed her hand. Over the past weeks, he'd been asking more questions about their life before. About their tiny apartment. About his father who died before he was born. About the playground where they used to spend Sunday afternoons. Each memory shared was like a small bridge being rebuilt between them. The detective pulled out more papers. "We're building a strong case. The former agency director is already in custody. But we need your testimony. Both of you." He looked between Marie and David. "It won't be easy. They'll try to discredit you, Marie. They'll bring up your financial struggles, your past." "I'm not ashamed of my past," Marie said firmly. "I was poor, not unfit. I loved my son. I still love him." Mr. Thompson, who'd been quietly listening, stepped forward. "We'll help. We have resources, connections. These people didn't just hurt Marie. They lied to us too. Made us unwitting participants in stealing children." Later that afternoon, as Marie was folding laundry upstairs, she overheard David talking to his adoptive parents in the study. "I want to use my trust fund," he was saying, "to help the other families. for legal fees, for therapy, whatever they need. Of course, Mrs. Thompson replied softly, "It's your money, but are you sure?" I got lucky. David's voice was thick with emotion. I ended up with you. You gave me everything. But those other kids, some of them weren't so lucky, and their parents never stopped looking either. Marie's hands stilled on the warm towels. Her boy had grown into such a good man. Both families had shaped that goodness, her early love and the Thompsons' years of care. The next day, they all went to the lawyer's office together. As Marie told her story, every painful detail, she felt David's hand slip into hers. Mrs. Thompson sat on his other side, tissue clutched in her free hand. Mr. Thompson stood behind them, a solid presence of support. "We found documents proving they targeted working-class neighborhoods," the lawyer explained. "They had a system. They'd watch for families using public assistance, families behind on rent or utilities. Then they'd swoop in, promising help. They said they'd help me find a better job," Marie remembered. "Said they knew programs for single mothers. Instead, they took everything." "Not everything," David said quietly. "They couldn't take away who you are, who we are. I have memories, little pieces I thought were dreams. You singing, your laugh, the way you'd read me stories using different voices." The lawyer nodded, making notes. "These details matter. Every memory, every document, every piece of evidence helps build the case. More families are coming forward every day." As they left the office, David turned to both his mothers. "I want to be there. When they go to trial, I want to speak too." Marie looked at her son, because that's what he was, no matter who else had raised him, and saw the same determination she carried all these years. The same need for justice, for truth, for healing. "We'll all be there," Mr. Thompson said. "Every step of the way. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's all of ours." 2 months after the DNA test, Marie found herself sitting in the Thompsons' backyard, watching David flip through her old photo albums. It had become their Sunday tradition, sharing memories over coffee while Mrs. Thompson baked something in the kitchen. Today, the smell of apple cinnamon muffins drifted through the open windows. "Wait, is this me on a toy fire truck?" David asked, pointing to a faded photograph. Marie smiled, remembering that day clearly. "You were 4. We saved up for 3 months to buy that truck. You wore the little firefighter hat to bed every night for weeks." Mrs. Thompson came out with a plate of warm muffins, settling into the chair beside them. These moments had been awkward at first, but they'd found their rhythm. 2 mothers, different pieces of the same story, both part of David's life in their own way. "I still have the hat," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "It was in the box of things they gave us when you came. I never knew the story behind it." David looked up, surprised. "You kept it." "I kept everything," she replied. "Even though they told us to start fresh, throw away the past, I couldn't. It felt wrong." Marie reached for a muffin, using the moment to wipe away tears. Every day brought new discoveries like this, small kindnesses that helped heal old wounds. The Thompsons hadn't just given David a home. They'd preserved pieces of his history, even when they didn't understand why. Later that afternoon, David brought out his laptop to show them both his law school application essay. He'd been working on it for weeks, rewriting it countless times. "I want to specialize in family law," he explained. "Help other families like ours." As he read the essay aloud, Marie heard their story through his eyes. The love of 2 families, the years of searching, the pain of separation, and the miracle of reunion. But most importantly, she heard hope. Hope for healing, for justice, for change. "There's something else," David said when he finished reading. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I've been thinking about my name." Both mothers held their breath. Names were powerful things, carrying history and identity. "I want to honor both my families," he continued. I was thinking of adding Wilson as a middle name, to have both parts of who I am. Marie's heart swelled. Wilson, her family name, the name she'd given him at birth. Mrs. Thompson reached over and squeezed her hand, both of them understanding the significance of this moment. David Wilson Thompson, Mrs. Thompson said softly. It's perfect. That evening, as they all sat down to dinner, something else that had become a Sunday tradition, Mr. Thompson raised his glass. To family, he said, in all its forms. David had been quieter than usual during dinner, pushing food around his plate. Finally, he spoke up. I've been having these dreams lately. Memories, I think. About the playground near our old apartment. Marie's fork paused halfway to her mouth, the one with the broken swing. Yeah, and the metal slide that got too hot in summer. He smiled slightly. You used to bring a water bottle to cool it down so I could slide. These moments still caught Marie off guard, pieces of their past surfacing unexpectedly, proving that their bond had never truly been broken, just buried beneath years of separation. Mrs. Thompson got up suddenly, returning with a small box. I think it's time for you to have these. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all unopened. They came to the agency over the years. They told us they were junk mail, but I kept them anyway. Marie recognized her own handwriting on the envelopes. All the letters she'd sent, trying to reach her son, had found their way here. David picked one up with trembling hands. Would you? He looked at both his mothers. Would you both sit with me while I read them? As the sun set outside, 3 people who had been strangers just months ago sat together, healing old wounds and building new connections, one memory, one letter, one moment at a time. Their family might not look traditional, but it was real and growing stronger every day. 1 year after the day, Mary first noticed David's photo on the Thompsons' wall. The mansion's backyard was filled with people. Families from across the state had gathered, all of them connected by similar stories of loss and reunion. The trial against New Beginnings Family Services had ended with justice served, but more importantly, it had created a community. Marie stood near the garden, watching David move through the crowd. He just finished his first year of law school, and already he helped establish a foundation to support families affected by adoption fraud. The Thompsons had matched every donation, turning their pain into purpose. Your boy did good, her sister whispered, squeezing her arm. Both your families did good. Mrs. Thompson approached with a tray of lemonade, the same way she had that first day Mary came to work at the house. But now, instead of employer and employee, they were something else. Something that didn't have a simple name, but felt like family all the same. The support group starts next week, Mrs. Thompson said, handing them drinks. The counselor thinks having both adoptive and birth parents there will help others see it's possible to heal together. Marie nodded, remembering their own first tentative steps toward healing. The awkward dinners that became warm gatherings. The careful conversations that grew into deep sharing. The way they'd all learned to make space for each other in David's life. Across the yard, David was talking to a young girl and her 2 mothers, another family they'd helped reunite. At 16, she was angry and confused, much like David had been at first. But watching him share their story, Marie could see hope blooming in the girl's eyes. Mr. Thompson joined them, carrying a large photo album. Look what I found in the attic, he said, opening it to reveal photos from the past year. There was David's law school acceptance celebration, both families crowded around him. The day they all testified at the trial, standing united. Christmas morning, with presents under the tree from both homes. Hard to believe it all started with a cleaning job, Marie said softly, touching a photo of David asleep on the couch, his head on her lap while Mrs. Thompson covered him with a blanket. Just then, David called everyone's attention. He stood on the patio steps, looking nervous but determined. A year ago, I thought family was something simple. You either had one or you didn't. Now I know better." He looked around at the gathered faces. Some of us lost years together. Some of us gained family we never expected. But standing here today, I see something amazing. I see love that survived separation. I see parents who never stopped searching. I see families who opened their hearts to new possibilities. Mrs. Thompson slipped her hand into Marie's, both of them watching their son with tears in their eyes. "The Foundation's first project is ready to launch," David continued. "We're opening a family reunification center, a place where separated families can get legal help, counseling, and support. A place where stories like ours can have happy endings." The announcement was met with applause and tears. Marie felt Mr. Thompson's hand on her shoulder. "We have something else to tell you," he said quietly when the crowd dispersed. "We want you to come work at the center. Not as a housekeeper, as a family advocate. Your experience, your strength. Other families need that." Marie's hand flew to her mouth. "After years of cleaning houses, of struggling to make ends meet. You helped us understand what these families go through," Mrs. Thompson added. "You taught us how to help them heal." David joined them, wrapping his arms around both his mothers. "So what do you say, Mom? Ready to help other families find their way home?" Marie looked at the people around her, her son, who had grown into an amazing young man, the Thompsons, who had become family in their own right, the other reunited families, all supporting each other. She thought of that first day, walking up the mansion's driveway, never imagining where it would lead. "Home," she repeated softly. "Yes, let's help others find their way home." As the sun set over the gathering, casting warm light over all their faces, Marie realized that sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where you're meant to be. Her path had been painful, but it had brought her here, to a place where love multiplied instead of divided, where wounds became wisdom, and where family meant something bigger than she ever imagined. And it had all started with a mother's heart recognizing her child, across time, across distance, across everything that had tried to keep them apart. Marie had been working at the Thompson house for a few hours when she started noticing the little things. While dusting the living room shelves, her eyes kept drifting to the family photos. The Thompsons' son smiled in every picture, from his childhood snapshots to recent graduation photos. There was something about his smile that made her heart skip a beat. She picked up a silver frame showing him at a football game, wearing his varsity jacket. Her hands started shaking. That dimple on his left cheek, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. It was like looking at a ghost from her past. He had the same features as her baby boy, all grown up in her dreams. "That's David at his championship game," Mrs. Thompson said, making Marie jump. She hadn't heard her come in. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. He was so happy that day. Scored the winning touchdown." Marie carefully placed the frame back, trying to keep her voice steady. "He seems like a wonderful young man." "Oh, he is. We adopted him when he was 7. Best decision we ever made." Mrs. Thompson's voice softened with pride. "Though sometimes I wonder about his birth mother. Must have been hard for her, giving him up." The duster nearly slipped from Marie's grip. 7 years old. The same age her son was when they took him. But it couldn't be, could it? The world wasn't that small, that cruel, or that magical. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Thompson asked, noticing Marie's pale face. "Yes, just the heat maybe," Marie managed to say. "Do you mind if I get some water?" In the kitchen, Marie splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm down. She was being ridiculous. Lots of kids were adopted at 7. Lots of boys had dimples and crinkly eyes when they smiled. She'd driven herself crazy before, seeing her son in every young man who crossed her path. But as she went back to work, more details jumped out at her. A childhood drawing sign with a wobbly D, showing a stick figure playing basketball. Her son had loved basketball, would spend hours bouncing a ball in their tiny apartment until the neighbors complained. There was a science fair trophy from middle school. Her boy had been so smart, always taking things apart to see how they worked. By the end of her first day, Marie's mind was racing. She found herself in front of the family photo wall again, studying a picture she'd missed earlier. David, maybe 12 years old, at a beach. He was laughing, his hand raised to block the sun. And there it was, the tiny birthmark on his wrist, shaped like a half moon. Her son had that same mark. Marie's legs felt weak. She grabbed the wall for support, memories flooding back. The social worker who'd seemed so eager to help, the documents she'd been pressured to sign when she lost her job, the promises that it was just temporary until she got back on her feet. Then suddenly, her baby was gone, lost in a system that wouldn't tell her anything. As she gathered her cleaning supplies to leave, Mrs. Thompson handed her tomorrow's schedule. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked warmly. Marie nodded, her mind already made up. She needed to know the truth, no matter what it cost her. But she had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and she could lose this job, and maybe her last chance to find her son.